Ukrainians are clearly losing. Nobody can deny it. The army on front lines is beginning to collapse. That's not to say Russia's then going to conquer all of Ukraine, but it's on the march. It's conquering more territory. The Ukrainians can hardly put up any defense, and people in the West can no longer continue to behave in the delusional manner that they have been behaving in recent years. And so you say they may escalate, they may do something crazy, but my question is, what can they do? What's the option here? They've searched for every possible military option. That's why there's all this attention on the tomahawks now. The tomahawks are the magic weapon. This is a joke. You can feel the realism in Mearsheimer's words. No spin, no fantasy. The truth is, wars collapse from belief before they collapse from bullets. And the West's fixation on the next miracle weapon isn't strategy, it's denial. When, instead of solutions, the narrative's cracking. If tomahawks were such a great weapon, why weren't they talking about tomahawks a year ago or 2 years ago? It's, sort of the last arrow in the quiver. And it, as Putin has said, and as we all know, it's not going to make much difference. It's not going to affect the outcome hardly at all. And if the Russians are winning, escalation on their part doesn't matter much. They're winning. So, I just don't see where the Europeans are going to go. And if you stay in the fight, even though you're losing, you just try and string it out for as long as you can. All that means is more of Ukraine is going to be lost to the Russians. More Ukrainians are going to die. Don't you reach a point here where the Ukrainians and the Europeans have to negotiate with the Russians? Or if that's not the case, it just seems to me the Russians are going to take more territory and kill more Uk. It's tragic how predictable this pattern is. When pride replaces logic, wars stop being about strategy. They become about saving face. History is full of leaders who kept fighting long after the outcome was decided. Vietnam, Afghanistan, even World War I's final months. And every time it's the ordinary people who pay for that denial. Mearsheimer's right. When the last arrow is fired, it's not courage anymore. It's stubbornness disguised as honor. If the Ukrainians do lose on the battlefield, they visibly lose. The army begins to collapse. What you're saying, in effect, is the centrifugal forces that are already at play in Europe will speed up, and if anything, there won't be a unified European position or anything close to it. In fact, you'll be moving in the other direction. And of course, if you marry that to the fact that the United States, and here we're talking about the Trump administration, would like to divorce itself from Europe and take the responsibility. Ukraine off America's shoulders and put it on Europe's shoulders. And here's Europe sort of disintegrating politically. This is in a very important way a catastrophic situation for Europe. If Ukraine falls, it won't just be a battlefield loss. It'll be a psychological one for Europe. Because the moment unity turns into self-preservation, alliances crumble. We saw it with the Soviet bloc. Once the center weakens, the edges break away fast. And this time, the US won't be there to hold it together. When dependence meets disintegration, it's not just a crisis. It's collapse in slow motion. If I could make one other point, just sort of switching to the other side, to the Russian side. I think the Russians are obviously doing very well on the battlefield. They're paying a price, of course, because that's inevitable in a war of attrition. But they're doing very well, much better than the Ukrainians, as we were saying. But I also think if you move away, what's happening on the battlefield, and you sort of go to the, let's call it the diplomatic rhetorical level, Putin is actually doing very well there, as well. You want to remember that one of the goals of the West, from the start, was to isolate Putin. And of course they failed miserably, in that regard. Especially with regard to countries like China and India. And if you look at what's recently happened with India, if anything, Trump's policies on tariffs vis-a-vis India has driven the Indians closer to the Russians and the Chinese. And the Russians, of course, are very close. So, Putin looks good there. But you also want to remember that Putin went to Alaska. He set foot in the United States. Now he is presumably going to Budapest. He's going to Hungary. That's a country that's in the European Union and is in NATO. Just want to think about that. And furthermore, Putin, he plays along with Trump. Putin surely understands that Trump is a loose cannon, and he says things that are at first blanch very offensive to Putin and the Russians. But Putin plays dice with them. Putin understands there's absolutely no point in retaliating. And what Putin wants to do is look diplomatic, and look reasonable, and look smart, and look informed, and look coherent. And whether you like Putin or not, he is brilliant at all those things. He just does a great job. So Putin looks like the only adult in the room, at least to me, and I think to increasing numbers of people. I know for it's true for both of you as well. When you compare him to Trump and the European leaders, there's just no comparison. So Putin is not only in a situation where he's doing very well on the battlefield, he's also doing very well at what I call the diplomatic/rhetorical level. It's strange how power shifts, not just on battlefields, but in perception. While Western leaders sound reactive, Putin's playing the long game, calm, strategic, and relentless. Diplomatic. That's how empires fade. Not when they're defeated, but when their rivals start looking more stable than they do. Optics matter in geopolitics. And right now, Moscow looks like order, while the West looks like noise. See, one problem I think that the Russians face is if they cut a deal in which they make certain concessions to the West. They're not as ambitious in terms of territorial goals as they could be. In other words, they can conquer more territory, but they don't do it because they want to facilitate a deal. The problem that they face is what happens if they cut a deal and then in 2 years, Trump or somebody else changes his or her mind, and Russia's not necessarily back to square one, but in bad shape. What I think is that the Russians now have very powerful incentives to pursue maximalist goals. I think you want to grab all the territory you can. You want to go to great lengths to make sure that Ukraine is a dysfunctional rump state. You want to do everything you can to make sure that the West and that dysfunctional Ukrainian rump state are far apart as possible. If you're the Russians, you've played this game where you trusted the West, right? You know you got involved in serious negotiations with regard to the Minsk Accords. And look what the West did to you. You just can't trust these people. And especially if you look at Donald Trump. Who in God's name would trust anything that Donald Trump says? He changes his views all the time, right? And so I think one of the real problems here in settling this war is that I think deep down inside, the Russians understand. And you see it with some of the spokespeople like Medved. They understand that they have to grab it all. Not all of Ukraine, but all they can get before they begin to run into trouble. This is what happens when trust collapses between powers. Negotiation dies, and only fear remains. After me. Russia learned that promises mean little in Western diplomacy. So now it's not about peace, it's about leverage. And when both sides believe betrayal is inevitable, every deal becomes just a pause before the next war. I think how the Russians think now, when there's very little movement on the battlefield. I mean, there is movement. I don't want to minimize it, but there's not major movement at this point in time. and the Ukrainian army has not collapsed is a very different situation than one where the Ukrainian army falls apart. I think if the Ukrainian army falls apart, the Russians are likely, I'm not saying for sure, we're speculating, of course. I think the Russians are likely to find that their appetite grows because at that point, it will be easy to take all of Zaporozhye, all of Kherson, and maybe even think about going into places like Odessa. And as you know, they're already moving into other oblasts besides those four, being one another. So the Russians are, conquering territory. And if the floodgates were to open, I would imagine that they'll grab a lot more territory. And again, the reason is they're now in a good position. They will not be in a good position in 2 or 3 years. You have an opportunity in front of you, and you're dealing with duplicative people you can't trust, and you have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Ukraine is really weak. I mean, I sound like I'm talking in very ruthless ways. But if you're the Russians and you feel like you've been betrayed by the West and you've fought this bloody war where lots of Russians have died, I think you're going to be quite hard-hearted in your thinking about what to do moving forward. This is the brutal logic of war. When opportunity opens, appetite follows. If Ukraine's army collapses, the map will redraw much faster than our moral debates can catch up. History teaches the same lesson. Their advantage and bargains come later, if they come at all. But never forget the cost. Strategic gains are cold comfort for the families who pay with blood. Admit that now, or be shocked by the outcome.